See, it's not just cover your butt stuff, because there's nothing preventing you from 11 minutes ago playing that.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, all right. It says it's all live. There it is. Okay. So where's everybody else tonight? Gee whiz.
It's chilly. They don't want to come out.
I guess so.
That's what I don't understand, Brother Mark. I just don't understand people.
I don't either.
We're in such a crisis as a country.
I know.
I think every church door should be open, and every church in this United States open 24 hours. And people ought to be going in and out praying. Because I'm telling you what, America's on its way out. I don't care what anybody says.
Yeah, I'm more than me. I mean, administrations come and go, Congresses come and go every 2 years. But when they start talking about deciding what you're going to receive as information and what you're going to be able to voice as far as your conscious opinion about it, then we are in real. In fact, well, George Washington said it. We lose those things and we're like sheep to the slaughter, and he's right. Then your vote doesn't matter, because that is the ultimate of expression of conscience. And if that is in any way shaped or restricted, then you have lost by the people, of the people, by the people, for the people. And I just fear that, not because of anything it's not even been being hidden.
We don't fight for anything.
Our former president said it on 60 Minutes, just as clear as you can say anything, that there needs to be a way for we.
Which one said it?
Barack Obama. He said that, let's see, how did he say it? That we, and he never specifies who we is. He can't mean we the people, because he is saying that we need to do a better job. And then he paused and said tech and the media of guaranteeing that what is being offered is the truth. And so I was sitting there thinking out loud, and I was thinking out loud, the gospel is truth. This word is truth. And you won't even, you're a part of the people that won't even pray at your convention or offer a word from
it. Now you have to wonder what truth he's talking
about.
Well, the truth of the Communist Party.
Well, my thing about that is the American people have always been trusted with the truth when it's available. So if we're no longer able to discern what is truthful, then why is that? Why has that changed so drastically in the last 20, 30 years? Either you have a media and an education system that is poor at teaching people how to think and to discern this truth, or you have a media and or education system that is shaping you not to be able to discern the truth for this very
Which is
purpose.
what they've done with our children for the last 20 years, maybe.
Yeah, or we really are dumber, where we cannot handle, like Jack Nicholson says, you can't handle the truth.
It's a little bit of all three columns of yes.
Yeah. So how do we overcome that? We can't overcome that just by saying, oh, well, it's our government, whatever, this, that, and the other. People have got to make up their minds that the truth matters.
People have rolled over and played dead, including myself. Where was everybody when that one woman took God out of our schools in 1962? I could have cared less. I was busy raising kids. I did not. All you have to do is pick up a phone. I'm just upset with people.
My software quit. I got to do this again.
Sound boy and all that. He said all that's going to be put back on the table. And then Biden, they said, is it gonna be by June?
Okay, I think I'm on.
He will not be in the picture, she'll be president. If he makes it till June, they said.
Yeah, and so and there's a lot of theories being passed around about that, since now they're going to allow the public to consume the whole thing that his son was involved in. And it's on, why now does it take 6 weeks? Why does it take an intelligent man 6 weeks to realize he's made a mistake?
Are you saying they're gonna bring it to the surface? I mean,
Well, it's now available on Twitter and Facebook,
okay,
which it wasn't before.
yeah.
I don't know what all that means. All I know is that more important than all of
How we got into the discussion, I don't know, because we're sitting outside her comment in the air without mask and everything. And she said,
all right.
well, I don't understand why God parted the Red Sea. I said, what? She said, why did he part the waters and kill all those people? And this is how she told me.
Yeah.
I said, are you talking about those Egyptians that were fixing to kill his people that they had kept in bondage for 400 years? I'm so sorry Jesus killed all those Egyptians. I said, that's awful. I feel bad. I was mocking her.
Yeah.
But she was serious.
Yeah.
And then the other sister says,
okay,
and I don't understand why God lets people die who don't deserve to die. I said, what are you talking about? She said, like a child in a car wreck or something of that nature. I said, well, I don't think that God lets that happen. I said, first of all, you have to figure out why they had the wreck and why the baby was killed to begin with. He could have been riding with a drunk daddy. Of that nature. I said, but God doesn't sit down and say, oh, I'm going to kill that baby in that car. That's what they were insinuating. It was awful. So now I said that to say this. Think how many other Catholics think like this.
yeah.
They believe this word has error.
Yeah.
And I said, go to Timothy, please, and read Timothy.
Yeah.
Why should we believe? So there you go. That's a lot of Catholics.
Well, that's and
Well, I'm not really talking about them. I'm talking about what they've been taught.
well, and even that, there's not gonna be a movement underfoot in the Catholic Church to dissuade truth, to make it where you cannot speak your conscience. They may not understand what they're reading, but there's not a movement underway in the Catholic Church that says you don't need to be reading this or that because it's going to mislead you in understanding the truth. Whereas in our culture right now, we have some very powerful people that are saying you don't need to know this or that because it will cloud what is the truth. Because they won't say that it's untrue.
The Catholic Church told you not, when I was little, they said do not read the Bible.
Yeah, well, that's changed some. Because they do have a translation of the Bible that they value and read. So
they said we interpret this.
That's yeah, but that's changed some.
I don't know if it has or not.
Yeah. I think that's been part of the struggle that the church has had.
They don't
is
read.
Making that shift.
They do not read the Bible.
Yeah.
I tell them all the time, don't pick your Bible up and read it. You want to know what's going on.
All right, well, enough of that rant.
Amen.
My rant.
Amen.
You're not. I'm not saying that you were ranting, but
I
I'm
told you I
ranting.
wasn't in a good mood.
I know.
Should stay home.
So we're in chapter 29 of 1 Samuel, and we're almost to the end of 1 Samuel. We will things really move kind of quickly once we get over into 2 Samuel. There's a lot of action that's going on, as much as we had in the first. we are moving to that point where David is decidedly king. There's not a whole lot that's going to stand in his way to being king. And from that we get into 2 Samuel and we see the growth of that. Last week we saw the very end of Saul. In fact, when we get to the end of chapter 28, it's almost as if he's had a last supper prepared for him, because it's the last thing that we experience Saul doing other than dying. And so Saul is over, and David, with the help of his very naive friend Achish, his ruse is about to be over, in the way that he has cleverly fooled Achish all this time about what he's really been about. So David, we find in chapter 29 that David's kind of moving away from his Philistine cover, and ultimately we'll see the end of that in the first part of 2 Samuel.
So what are we?
So chapter 29.
In the 1 or 2?
In 1. Yeah, so the Philistines brought all their military units together at Aphek, while Israel was camped by the spring in Jezreel. So this takes us back to the beginning of 28. It's kind of a repeat of 28. So what happens with Saul in the meantime is an interlude. While the Philistines are getting ready for battle, Saul is off seeking out a medium, looking for a positive word from Samuel of all people. And Samuel tells him worse news than he had ever dreamed he would hear, that he and his line will die out by the hands of his hated enemy, the Philistines. So now we're back to the preparation of that great conflict that's building. The Philistines brought all the military units together at Aphek while Israel was camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine leaders were passing in review with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were passing in review behind them with Achish. Then the Philistine commanders asked, "What are these Hebrews doing here?" So remember, Achish is so impressed with David, he's made David and his 600 men his own personal bodyguards. But you get the feeling that the other commanders kind of know what David's been up to, or they know the gullibility of their king, or as likely, they're just suspicious of a Hebrew being in camp while they're about to go attack Hebrews. And the word Hebrew, by the way, when it's used coming out of the lips of a foreigner, was a very derogatory term. There was nothing. The word carried over from their time in Egypt when they were Hebrew slaves. So they were not thought, if you called them a Hebrew and you were not a Hebrew, then it was considered very derogatory.
This time or in the future?
No, this time. The Philistines used the word Hebrew as a slang word. Yeah. So Achish answered the Philistine commanders, "This is David, servant of King Saul of Israel. He has been with me a considerable period of time. Over a year, David's been there. From the day he defected until today, I have found no fault in him," which is ironic. Okay, so David's been lying to him for a year. He hasn't harmed anybody in Judea. He's only attacked the other enemies of Achish, and he's kind of built a good relationship, with his people during this time. So Achish really sounds like a fool here. The Philistine commanders, however, were enraged with Achish and told him, "Send this man back and let him return to the place you assigned him, which is Ziklag. He must not go down with us into battle, only to become our adversary during the battle. What better way could he ingratiate himself with his master than with the heads of our men?" So they see David is getting into battle and then double crossing them. See?
So the guys know it, but Achish don't.
Yeah, but Achish still thinks that David's just the greatest thing in the world, which everybody thinks David is great, except these commanders who have a real suspicion of his motives. And even if they don't know what David's been about, they're still suspicious of his motives. Isn't this the David they sing about during their dances? Saul has killed his thousands, but David his tens of thousands. So remember, that's what the women were singing at the very beginning of this whole story of David and Saul after he had killed Goliath. And so the Philistines only know this story about David and Saul. They don't know the conflict that's been going on ever since David killed Goliath and found favor with all the people. So they think that David and Saul are tied together at the hip, since they're tied together in this great folklore that's been built about them. So Achish summoned David and told him, "As the Lord lives, you are an honorable man. I think it is good to have you fighting in this unit with me, because I have found no fault in you from the day you came to me until today." Again, here's this praise again for David. 3 times this happens. "But the leaders don't think that you're reliable. Now go quietly, and you won't do anything the Philistine leaders think is wrong." "But what have I done?" David replied to Achish. "From the first day I entered your service until today, what have you found against your servant to keep me from going to fight against the enemies of my Lord and King?" Achish answered David, "I'm convinced that you are reliable as an angel of God, but the Philistine commanders have said he must not go into battle with us." I'm going to stop there for a minute. Yeah. So
Achish don't have any choice.
He don't have any choice. It's either lose David or lose his army. See, he'd rather just tell David, quietly go back. We can do this without you. All right. But there's something interesting about this whole scene. So David comes and he's being accused. And 3 times the king says, "I can't really find anything against you, so I'm just going to let you go."
Why do you think that was?
Well,
Was he dumb or stupid?
he was either terribly gullible, terribly trusting of people, or he just wasn't paying attention to what was happening around him. But 3 times Pilate says to Jesus' accusers, I can't find anything wrong with this man. There's nothing wrong with this. But eventually he said, "Well, have your way," and crucify Jesus. Well, he basically says, "I've got to let these guys have their way, and you just go on." And it's kind of amazing how that parallel exists for David, who is the king of Israel by all accounts through history, and then there stands Jesus, the king of heaven and earth, that's receiving the same kind of treatment his father had received. Only for Jesus, of course, it had much greater implications. But Achish is in a very unwitting way. He is preparing to set free he is setting free the future king. Okay, but he's also going into battle to kill the current king. So Achish is quite important in this story, because he liberates David to go back home, and we'll see here in the next chapter how that particular opportunity creates all sort of conflict and promise at the same time for David.
Could it be David's youth too?
You mean as compared to Achish youth? I don't know, maybe. But it had everything to do with the commanders believing that David could not be trusted. Mm-hmm. The same thing the Pharisees and the scribes and Sadducees believed about Jesus. This man can't be trusted. Better one man to die than the whole nation die. We cannot trust him. And because he had proven himself to be quite an adversary. Same thing with this. David, even in the folklore, David had proven himself to be quite an adversary to the Philistines. In fact, he was celebrated by the Hebrew people as a killer of Philistines. See, so some parallels there that I thought were interesting, and I didn't stumble upon that myself. Every commentator that I read about this whole this chapter brought those things to light. So get up early in the morning. This is verse 10. Get up early in the morning, you and your master's servants who came with you. So he's calling Saul David's master. When you've all gotten up early, go as soon as it's light. So David and his men got up early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now, this is not Achish telling David to sneak off before everybody's awake. This is, again, Achish looking out for David, because this journey that they have is about a 3-day journey. And so he's wanting him to get up early while it's still cool, so they can make as many miles as they can make, because it's about a 50, 60 mile distance that they're having to travel there. So they do. They get up and leave.
By horse? By horse?
No, I think they were on foot, probably.
That's what somebody said.
That's what most of the travel was done.
Even when they went to battle?
Well, and particularly in David's case, because you got to remember, he was a nomad. He was going from place to place, kind of like a scavenger. And he had 600 men to support, plus their families. So he's got a lot of people that he's moving around. And if you had livestock that you also had to care for and feed, then all you've done is increase the burden that you would have had. So most of them, it was on foot, because they really didn't have the resources to keep up with livestock like that. For an army to have, when it says that they have 10,000 chariots, let's say it's only 1,000. Let's say that that's an exaggerated number, and there's reason to believe that a lot of those numbers were exaggerated. Think about what it takes to take care of 1,000 horses. It's a lot. Yeah. So David and his men arrived in Ziklag on the 3rd day. The Amalekites had raided the Negev and attacked and burned Ziklag. So you remember the Amalekites. God had this burning vengeance against Amalek for what he had done to his children while they were in the desert. And so Saul, hey.
All right.
Yeah.
Huge crowd.
I don't know where everybody is. You doing all right?
Yes.
Good.
I saw it's too cold
All
for
right,
everybody to come out. Cold snap.
So,
Chris.
Look, I'm gonna run to the bathroom.
Okay.
Catch them up.
yeah.
I
Yeah,
took
I will.
22 pills and 2 big glasses of water.
Uh-oh.
I forgot to take them this morning.
Oh my goodness. So we just went through chapter 29 and talking about David being told by his Philistine proxy, Achish, or not his proxy, I guess he's David's benefactor. David's been living with him for a year. It's time for the Philistines to go into battle against the Hebrews. And Achish's commanders, they don't want David anywhere near that battle, because they fear that he's going to turn on them, that he's still loyal to Saul. And of course, we know that that's not the case. But and what we spent the most time, I guess, discussing in that is that David is still able to, in a very conniving way, fool Achish. He's already fooled Nabal, and now he's fooled Achish, not for the first time, but for the second time. The first time, when he was with Achish, he feigned being out of his mind, drooling down his beard and all that stuff to make him look like he's a crazy man. And Achish said, what are you doing, bringing me more crazy people to live with me? And he let him go. So he's here again, and he's fooling Achish again, because all this time that Achish thinks that he's attacking his own people, he's actually not. He's attacking other enemies of the Philistines and taking all their stuff and bringing it to Achish, and everybody's happy with David, although it's really a big lie again. So he's really a cunning guy. And 3 times here, Achish defends David. He says, "I know that you're honorable. I know that you're trustworthy. You're as wonderful as an angel." Okay, and we were comparing that to the scene of Jesus before Pilate. And on 3 different occasions, Jesus's accusers came to accuse Jesus, and on 3 different occasions, Pilate said, "I can't find anything wrong with this guy." Okay, and so Achish is doing the same thing. And of course, at the end, Achish lets the commanders have their way and tells David to leave. And of course, Jesus' accusers have their way, and leading to his ultimate crucifixion and our salvation. Likewise, Achish doesn't realize, but he's really protecting the future king of Judea, in Israel, that will come against him later, while he prepares to go to battle to eliminate the very king that will set David free to be king. So in the same way, they turn Jesus over to his enemies, expecting to crucify him, but all they do is set him free to be precisely what God sent him here to be. So there's some really marvelous parallels there that only God could have ever constructed. Yeah. So now when we get to chapter 30, David's gone back to Ziklag, and it's been burned because the Amalekites have burned it. They've been on a raiding party. They probably were watching. David's been raiding them and taking their stuff. And so they probably realized that the Philistines were mounting for a war with the Israelites, and that David would be with them, and it was a good time to go pay back David, So they go to Ziklag, the city that Achish had given him, and they burned it and took everybody captive. All right, so David and them get there. There's no dead people around. It's only a burned city, so they can rightfully assume that everyone's been captured. So they had kidnapped the women and everyone in it, from the youngest to the oldest. They had killed no one, but had carried them off as they went on their way. Now, when David and his men arrived at the town, they found it burned. Their wives, sons, and daughters had been kidnapped. So here we find this repetition of the same event twice now, very close to each other, clustered together with one another. So it is important for us to know that not all hope is lost here, that they have been kidnapped and carried away, which means there is room in this whole episode for David to act. Mm-hmm. All right, and that's what this is reminding us of. David and the troops with him wept loudly until they had no strength left to weep, which is a remarkable statement. That's great grief. Okay. David's 2 wives, Ahinoam and the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite, had also been kidnapped. David was in an extremely difficult position because the troops talked about stoning him, for they were all very bitter over the loss of their sons and daughters. They don't mention their wives the second time around. But David found strength in the Lord. Okay, so here's a summary statement. There's a terrible thing that has happened, but there's a glimpse of hope in the midst of that. No one's been killed; they've been carried off. But then we shift right back into this point of conflict and pressure on David, because now his men are ready to kill him. You took us off to go fight with Philistines, which they probably didn't want to do anyway, and now we've lost our families and everything, and we've had enough of this. And so the narrator, without putting words yet into David's mouth, lets us know that the only way that David gets out of this place of conflict and crisis of leadership And the only hope he has of exploiting the glimmer of hope of the kidnapping and not a slaughter is with God. And that's the point that the narrator is bringing us to. David found strength in the Lord his God. So David said to the priest Abiathar, son of Ahimelech, bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought it to him, and David asked the Lord, should I pursue these raiders? Will I overtake them? And the Lord replied to him, pursue them, for you will certainly overtake them and rescue the people. Simple, straightforward answer. Now you compare this to chapter 28 when Saul sneaks off in the middle of the night to go to the witch of Endor and have to consult Samuel, who is dead, because God won't have anything to do with Saul. Okay, but here we have David, and David says, Lord, what do I do? This is exactly what you do. And so the two episodes bring to light again how far and away Saul had let his life sink, and how David, even in the midst of great tragedy, and even with the light of a little bit of hope there, David knows exactly what to do. He never takes his eyes off God, and that's why God has never taken his eyes off David. There's the relationship. So when God does say, there's one that is a man after my own heart, he's more than saying he just knows who I am and appreciates who I am. And you see in these encounters the great relationship that exists there, and it's readily there. It's not hidden at all. When David calls, God answers. So the Lord replied to him. So David and the 600 men went with. So David and the 600 men went with him. With him went. I don't know why they word that way.
600 men with him.
Went. Yeah, that's.
Who were with him?
I don't know. They came to the Wadi Bezor, or Besor, I don't know how they say it, when some stayed behind. Okay, David and 400, so 200 stayed behind. Of the men continued the pursuit while 200 stopped because they were too exhausted to cross the wadi. So now the emphasis is that 200 have stayed behind and they're exhausted. The reason why they've stayed behind is they're not as strong. They're weaker than the 400 that go ahead. David's men found an Egyptian in the open country and brought him to David. They gave him some bread to eat and water to drink. They gave him some pressed figs and 2 clusters of raisins.
Where did he get all that from?
Well, when you got 400 men with you, you got to be carrying some food with you. Ziklag. So after he ate, he revived, for he hadn't eaten food or drunk water for 3 days and 3 nights. So here's the 3 days and 3 nights again. Took David and them 3 days and 3 nights. It took them 3 to get back to Ziklag, and here's this Egyptian who has been 3 days and 3 nights away from his commander. Okay. And the reason we had that little bit of information is to give us a time frame as to what's going on here. So we're 6. By the time they get would catch up with the Amaleks, they're 6 to 8 days away from the other Philistine army. So nobody really knows what's going on here. All right. But again, we find David in this place. You remember back when the men were coming to David, it was all those that had been ejected and misused by the king. They were in want of a life. And here's this Egyptian, he too is one that is in want of a life because he's about to die. David revives him, and he, lo and behold, helps David. All right? So he says, I'm an Egyptian, the slave of an Amalekite man, he said. My master abandoned me when I got sick 3 days ago. We raided the south country of the Cherethites, the territory of Judah, and the south country of Caleb, and we burned Ziklag. So this guy's a wealth of information. So this guy, these Amalekites have been causing trouble in Judah. All right. So David asked him, will you lead us to these raiders? And he said, swear to me by God that you won't kill me or turn me over to my master, and I will lead you to them. So we don't get a word out of David's mouth, but he leads them. So obviously, David has met his conditions. So he led them, and there were the Amalekites spread out over the entire area. And so we're to have some geographical idea of what that is, because the original readers did, but we have no idea. It doesn't give us enough information. But they're spread out everywhere. And the idea is they're eating, they're drinking, and they're celebrating because of the great amount of plunder that they had taken from the land of the Philistines and the land of Judah. So this idea that they're spread out everywhere, they got food, they got drink, they got stuff everywhere that they've taken from all these people. So they're made out to look like a debaucherous people. No respect for their sobriety, no respect. They're just eating food, glutton, just kind of, and then they've occupied more area than is really necessary. So the whole thing is just over the top. And then verse 17. All this is proclaimed to us just in the narrative. David slaughtered them from twilight until the evening of the next day. For nearly 2 days, David and his men slaughtered these people. None of them escaped except for 400 young men who got on camels and fled. So oddly enough, it's the same number that David has with him. So for the 400 that are there successful in battle, with David, there's 400 that got away. So David recovered everything the Amalekites had taken. He also rescued his 2 wives. Nothing of theirs was missing, from the youngest to the oldest, including the sons and daughters, and all the plunder the Amalekites had taken. David got everything back. So when we look at on the 2 occasions where Saul was told not to bring the plunder back, and he does, on both occasions, it causes him great problems with God and for himself, really. But in this occasion, the narrator doesn't indicate that David has taken plunder. It's saying that David has recovered. Okay, so what was done, even here again, we find what Saul did in taking, David is going to do by returning and giving away. We'll see here in a minute. So we have again this idea. We're moving away from the old order because Saul was a taker and he did things his own way. And we're going to find that David, he recovers, okay, and he covers his own stuff. But we're going to see how important the way that he deals with this now becomes important for the rest of his time as king. And it also gives us this focal point looking back to the law. It begins in verse 21. When David came to the 200 men who had been too exhausted to go with him and had been left at the Wadi Bezor, they came out to meet him and to meet the troops with him. When David approached the men, he greeted them. But all the corrupt and worthless men among those who had gone with David argued, because they didn't go with us, we will not give any of the plunder we recovered to them, except for each man's wife and children. they may take them and go. So here we have the old way of doing things. If you go into battle, you get to keep the stuff. All right, that was it. So that's why you went into battle. That's why the Philistines kept attacking. They would go because they wanted to harvest, or they wanted stuff, or they wanted wives, or just anything they wanted, they went and took. That was the way of the world. That was the way that the Israelites had done it. That's the way Saul had done it. Okay? And now we get to this place where David's men, 600 strong, 200 weak. The 400 go, they come back. And the old way of doing this is, we're going to keep all the stuff. They can have their wives and children back, but we're keeping the stuff. All right. So how does the narrator calls them what? Corrupt and worthless men. Okay. So that's pretty strong words for somebody that just wants to do things the way it's always been done. So what makes them worthless and corrupt? Let's read on and see if we get any clues. But David said, my brothers. So he's not speaking to them as king yet. He's speaking to them as brothers. Now this word carries great strength in it. To have a brother was just a wonderful thing, especially in this period of history. You relied on each other. Brothers formed pacts together where they could become stronger together than they would be apart. Brothers were important, and he speaks to them as a place of equality instead of one that's lording over. Although they see him as king and they see him as their leader, he speaks to them in a way that brings about equality. He says, my brothers, you must not do this with what the Lord has given us. So now, David, remember, God wanted it all destroyed, and Saul kept it for himself. And now David is saying to them, the only reason why we have this is because it belongs to God. We knew already that God does away with these things, but now he has given it to us. It belongs to him. That's different. That's a different way to think about your whole economic system, because this was a system that they worked under. The way that you got ahead economically was to go steal it from somebody else. That's how you did it. Everybody was producing something, but the only way you were ever going to get ahead was to steal and then more than likely trade it back. So you got a double dip, see? He said, my brothers, we must not do this with what the Lord has given us. He protected us and handed over to us the raiders who came against us. So now he even broadens it. Not only did God provide us this, he's provided us with our very life. We stand here at this wadi with these that were weak because we weren't strong enough to overcome the Philistines ourselves. God did all of this. So a man's strength has been totally eliminated in this. It's all God that has done all of this, which again is not unheard of, but unexpected. You got to remember, for the last year, David very cunningly and craftily has been raiding the Philistine enemies and keeping plunder for themselves and passing a little bit up to the king Achish. So he thinks that he's helping him out. And his men have been doing this for a year. They've gotten really comfortable with doing things the way that they do it. It's provided for their material needs quite well. And David is saying, it's time that we started paying attention to our spiritual life with God and less about this stuff. He doesn't say those words, but that's what you're thinking. If you're there and you've been fighting and killing and all of that for a year, 2 years, and then all of a sudden, what? We've been doing this for God? David says, absolutely, because he's been doing it for us. So what has he done? He's got this relationship with God where he speaks to God and God speaks right back to him and says, yeah, I'm going to take care of you. And so now David is transferring that particular kind of thinking right into his men. He says, you are who you are today. You're standing here in this wadi because God is taking care of you. You need to begin to recognize that. You need to begin to recognize that all that this has been about for the last year has not been about getting stuff. This has been about protecting our people back at home who really, some of them don't want us killed. They want us to die because they're loyal to Saul. But that's still, we've done what we've done because Saul's the anointed, remember? He wouldn't lay a hand on him. And these are your brothers too. You see how all of this is just changing all at once. And it's happening out in the middle of the desert, not on some throne somewhere. It's happening because that is what life with God happens with David wherever David is. Who can agree to your proposal? The share of the one who goes into battle is the same as the share of the one who remains with the supplies. They will share equally. Now David's even being really generous to those that stayed behind. Earlier, the narrator tells us that they're just too weak to go. And David says, we needed somebody to stay with supplies. If they hadn't stayed with supplies, we may not have the supplies we have now. So he's become very equitable. And now all of a sudden, it doesn't matter what your role has been in this. If you stayed at the wadi and protected the supplies or you went in to battle, God is caring for all of you the same because this is his stuff.
But David basically was that kind of man.
Well, he's proven to be that kind of man right now.
Well, he's raised to be that man. So
you remember the parable where Jesus tells the parable of the man who goes and he hires people to work in his field, and he goes at 9 in the morning and he hires some, and then he goes again at noon, and he goes again at late in the day, and then it comes time to pay them, and when they all show up, they're all paid the same. And the ones that came to work earliest, started complaining. How come you gave them the same amount that I slaved for you all day and they didn't work but 10 minutes and you gave them the same? And the lesson is it's about the kingdom of God is what he's talking about. Then he says then Jesus says, well, are you going to fault me for being generous? I didn't even need anybody to work today, but I came and got you to work. So do you fault me for being generous? And so here, David is saying, your argument really doesn't have any muster because you're going to fault me for being generous with stuff that doesn't even belong to me. I'm being overly gracious with everyone here because it's not even ours, it's God's. Mm-hmm. So it's a remarkable story,
Well, you gotta really know what you read.
Well, you can't just read it as a story. Yeah, that'll put you to sleep. If you really want to go to sleep at night, just read this stuff and not think about it. A long time ago.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, actually, I was preaching on the parable, and I referred back to this.
Yeah. I remember. I was there when you preached.
Who knows?
I was listening.
Hallelujah. I love to hear it when somebody's listening. And listen to this, verse 25. And it has been so from this day forward. David established this policy as a law and an ordinance for Israel, and it still continues today. So what David did that day was not just a moment in time. This became the norm for life in Israel. Okay, God had done the same thing through the law, if you recall. The whole gleaning laws and privilege that existed. Don't harvest your field all the way to the edges. Leave some so that those who are weaker and the foreigner can have something to eat. So God has always been about this kind of thing. But here he has this man after his own heart who has been in this relationship with him of understanding. It's more than just a God of protection and a God of provision.
David's in this relationship of understanding where he said, this is what this has been about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the moment that he needs this the most, it all comes together for David. Everything comes together. It's like the light bulbs go off for him all at once. And this may be the instance where you really begin to see David actually act like a king for God, this theocratic king that's going to let God rule through him. So when David came to Ziklag, he sent some of the plunder. Listen to this. So David's got all this plunder that's been taken from Judah and from other places. So now what does he do with it? He shares it. The people that he's been alienated from, his own people, who he's in a passive way, he's been protecting for the last year and 4 months while he's been with Achish. He hasn't attacked them, but he's attacked everybody else. Now, David sent some of the plunder to his friends, the elders of Judah, saying, this is a gift for you from the plunder of the Lord's enemies. Then he lists all these places where he sent the gifts. Those in Bethel and Ramoth of the Negev and Jatir, I think is how you see that. To those in Aurora, in Sifmoth and Eshtemoa. To those in, I'm probably butchering all these names, Rakal, Oracle, in the towns of the Jerahmeelites and in the towns of the Kenites, to those in Hormah and in Borishan and in Athik. Then the last one he lists, to those in Hebron, and to those in all the places where David and his men had roamed. Okay, so here we are. The last place that's mentioned is Hebron. And that becomes an important place because that's where David ultimately sets up his initial kingdom. So we kind of got this at the end of 1 Samuel, we're introduced to a place we haven't been introduced to before, which if you've noticed, Samuel, the writer of 1 Samuel, has been famous for introducing people, and then later they become bigger than life. So we've already mentioned Abner once. He was the captain of Saul's army. Abner becomes very important in 2 Samuel. The priest Abiathar becomes an important priestly character, more important in 2 Samuel. And now we've been shown Hebron, and it becomes important too. So it being at the end of that list kind of points to that. The most important place was listed last, usually.
Are any of these towns still in existence? Find them on a map?
There are archaeological digs, they call them Tell, and then they'll have a name after them. So in a lot of these Tell archaeological digs, they believe are many of these cities that are listed in the Bible. There was one just recently. They were doing an archaeological dig, and they determined it to be one city, and they kept digging, and they found another city under the city. So now people that do this archaeological stuff, that's just the most exciting thing in the world because they've had it wrong for 300 years, and now they're going to go back and figure out what's going on. But yeah, a lot of them are identifiable, and a lot of them are under excavation today. One of the biggest industries in that part of the world still is archaeology. There's a lot of money spent. That's why nobody really wants a war in Gaza or Egypt or any of that over there. That's why they shoot these little bottle rockets at each other. Because if it ever broke out in the war, they lose billions and billions of dollars just in people coming over there to do this kind of stuff. And yeah. So that ends chapter 30. Now, I haven't really. What time is it? Oh yeah, we got a little time. The death of Saul and his sons is almost anticlimactic to what we just experienced with David and his great victory and what he has done with that victory. This is almost what we've been looking forward to ever since Samuel announced it, that you're going to die, and this is the end for you. And this whole episode with David and Saul is like, okay, so you said this is the end of me, and I know who is going to cause the end of me. So Saul spends his whole life running down David and trying to kill David, thinking if I can just get rid of David, I'll be okay. And well, God wouldn't have ever stood for it. Yeah. So it was almost it was all futile from the very beginning.
Is he still chasing David?
No, not now.
David went.
Him and David, yeah.
I forgot there was this.
Yeah.
Thing about
What has happened here is exactly what Samuel told him would happen. Your hated enemy, the one that hates you, is going to destroy you. And of course he referred to the Philistines, but that's how he refers to them. These Philistines that hate you, they're going to be the ones that destroy you. And David never had any measure of hate for Saul.
Right.
He always treated him with the anointing that God had provided Saul. Okay. So this final chapter is really tragic because of the way that everything happens. And we'll look at it. And okay, great. So in chapter 31, so the Philistines fought against Israel, and Israel's men fled from them and were killed on Mount Gilboa. So here's this one little tight clustered area that all of this has happened around Jezreel, Gilboa. All of these events are happening in the same geographical area. So it says, that's kind of a summary statement at the beginning. The Philistines pursued Saul and his sons and killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and whatever that is, Malchishua. So first time we hear about these other guys, it's just always been Jonathan, and we only know really of Jonathan because of who? David. When the battle intensified against Saul, the archers found him and severely wounded him. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through with it, or these uncircumcised men will come and run me through and torture me." But his armor bearer would not do it because he was terrified. Then Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his own sword and died with him. So you remember earlier when I talked about how the ones that had gone with Saul to see the witch, and they hear everything that Samuel says to Saul about his own death and about being defeated. And these guys never say a word. They're just loyal. This is their king and they're loyal. So they see him famished and they encourage him to eat, and the witch brings him something to eat, and he eats and he feels revived. And these guys stay right there with him. And here's one of them, more than likely, who was there and had heard the words that your whole army is going to be wiped out. And so he stands loyal with his king, and he fell on his sword too.
I guess it'd be that devoted to somebody that you kill yourself.
That's your reason for living.
It's a very emotional thing.
Well, we have a king. We take up our cross daily.
Oh, yeah, that's the king.
Yeah.
Saul was not.
Yeah. He didn't know any different. He was Lord's anointed. They knew no different. They didn't know anything of the backstory. That's what's so remarkable about this whole thing. This is a story of a rise of a king, and nobody knows that he's going to be the king.
Yeah.
Only God knows. So on that day, Saul died together with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men. When the men of Israel on the other side of the valley and on the other side of the Jordan saw that Israel's men had fled and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. So the Philistines came and settled in them. So this was how it happened. So here we have the great contrast between David and the Philistines, right? David, he conquers and he shares the wealth and makes sure that it's done in a way that acknowledges God. Here, the people of Israel are defeated, they run, and the Philistines go in and they just take over, like locusts sweeping in and inhabiting the desert. Or like Agamemnon going marching into Troy and taking Troy. It was just a matter of pillage and defeat. The next day when the Philistines came to strip the slain, they found Saul and his 3 sons dead on Mount Gilboa. They cut off Saul's head, stripped off his armor, and sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to spread the good news, the gospel, in the temples of their idols and among the people. So this was as good as their gods defeating Yahweh. We defeated Yahweh's man, or so they think. And so they go and they declare this in their temples. So this has been as much a battle of the gods as has been a battle of people or a battle of kings, see. And to be stripped of his armor, for a king or a general or commander to be stripped of their armor was as good as dead. Okay, so this is just more insult to injury, is what the writer is letting us in on here. Then they put his armor in the temple of the Ashtoreth, I can't talk, and hung his body on the wall of Bethshan. So here he is. His armor is in a pagan temple, and this is his naked body that's just going to hang there, and when they mean till it just rots. Oh yeah. When the residents of Jabesh Gilead heard of what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their brave men set out, journeyed all night, and retrieved the body of Saul and the bodies of his sons from the wall of Bethshan. When they arrived at Jabesh, they burned their bodies there. Afterward, they took their bones and buried them under the tamarisk tree at Jabesh, fasted for 7 days. So this is the same tree where Saul was sitting earlier when he first began his downward spiral over David. And now this is where his bones lay. So it's a poetic ending because the place where he began his spiritual and political and ruling demise is the place where now his bones lay. And that puts a final destructive end to Saul. He's not mentioned hardly anymore. David, we see in the first chapter, David laments the death of Saul, but then moves on. So that gets us through 1 Samuel. So what the game plan, we'll go through 2 Samuel, and we'll do it in much the same way we did this. And then, as I mentioned before, when we get into 1 and 2 Kings, we will do 1 Chronicles and 1 Kings together where they parallel. So we'll study mainly 1 Kings, and then we will augment it with our 1 Chronicles, 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. And then when we have passages that refer back to prophetic writings or prophets that are speaking into the moment, then we will go and look at those prophetic teachings.
So why do they go parallel? They both happen at the same time?
They cover the same things to a large degree.
But not at different times.
No, same time, but the two different authors. So Chronicles is written mainly by the priestly group, It's written from a more religious standpoint. They make everything rosy for the priest, when not, and you look in Kings and thinking, oh, them priests weren't all that good. Well, that's because it's written from a different point of view, but the two together provide us a more complete study of what happens. So that's how we'll look at it. And it'll take us a little bit more time to do those. We'll probably be wrapping all this up about this time next year, probably.
What?
Yeah.
2 Kings and 2 Chronicles? Take that long?
And by the time you throw in a few prophets here and there, yeah, it's going to take a little bit.
This is November.
Yeah. Are you having fun?
Yeah,
I
do you
was.
realize how
You
fast
were.
time runs? I was like, can you believe it's here? Everything
I know.
is all done.
This is my fifth
The only
birthday,
thing
I'm
is the
done.
factory closed.
I know it's this year's,
Well,
even with
I
all
don't
that's
know,
happened, it's
yeah,
like it just went
crazy,
away. Yeah.
it's so fast.
Well, the way you teach it, it's okay. And if you were a good teacher, I would have come. Well, I mean, you gotta understand.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely.
Well,
I mean, so good, I don't ask a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's right.
it is,
It's a difference in loving the word and, like, loving the word of God. And someone just,
thank you all for watching.
how did they see? I don't see any
Is that
paraphernalia.
working?
If I do it on this.